Welcome to Casual Friday. Finish It February continues, so I'm going to be talking about my works in progress, the things I've finished, the things I've almost finished, even something I started brand new, which normally is a no-no for me in Finish It February. Then I want to talk about a UFO that I showed you last week that I determined was no longer a work in progress, that I was putting it to the side and would not continue working on it anymore. And I want to talk about this project because my decision to no longer work on it and the reaction I got to that, I believe is a interesting reflection on how economic theory and behavioral psychology figures into our knitting. I'll put some links down in the description so that you can jump from section to section if you like. So a few weeks ago, I introduced you to this red scarf, which was a scarf begun several years ago by a woman named Karen who did a lot of charity knitting, and she died. And so her knitting group had offered to finish all her charity projects, and this particular one was one where the group really wasn't sure what to do about it next. I took it on. I said I would finish it. It turned out one ball of yarn had been used so far, and Karen had originally intended to use 3 balls of yarn, but there was only 1 additional ball of yarn in the project bag. So I needed to figure out a way to make this scarf, turn it into something useful and also preserve the knitting that Karen had begun. I'm going to show you in the overhead what the beginning of the scarf, how it starts, and it turns into this diamond pattern, elongated diamond pattern, and then at the end there's a finishing sequence that's a little bit that mirrors the beginning sequence but is different from what's going on throughout the rest of the scarf. And so as I was getting near to the end of the finishing sequence, I ran out of yarn when I was just a couple of rows short. What I decided to do was to connect the end of the scarf to the beginning of the scarf in a way that looks like it just kind of blends and starts again. And so that's what I did. So I ended up with a ring, a scarf ring that's about 45 inches in circumference. So it's not really long enough for a standard scarf. It is long enough to wear around the neck like this, and even long enough to double up like this. So it is usable in this form as an infinity scarf. It wouldn't really be usable as a flat scarf. It just wouldn't be long enough to wrap around twice, but in this form it is long enough. So that is the first item in Finish It February that I have completed. So a couple of months ago when I was knitting a sweater using a chainette yarn, I got really interested in chainette yarns and blow yarns and wanting to explore them a little further. And so I bought several skeins in different yarn weights, different chainette yarns and different blow yarns. So one of the yarns I bought was from Shibui Knits. It's called, I don't know how to pronounce this, Mai, M-A-A-I. So I bought it in this kind of teal color, and then I bought it in a charcoal gray color. I don't know that I'd ever knit with any Shibui yarns before, but my understanding is that they often combine 2 of their yarns, different yarns, together and then produce patterns that create those blended combinations. But I was just buying the yarn on its own. So my husband looked on Ravelry and he found a hat he really liked. And I was swatching, I said, I don't think this is the right yarn for that hat. I think the yarn is a little too textured. I just didn't think it was the right yarn, but he wasn't convinced, and I wasn't loving the process of trying to knit that pattern with the yarn. But I decided yesterday was his birthday and I hadn't made him a hat yet, so I was going to go ahead and do the hat that he wanted using the yarn that he had selected. And so I'm about 75% of the way done. It's funny how you don't have to get very far in a hat in order to be pretty far along. It starts out as twisted knit, so knit through the back loop, purl, alternating between those two for a little bit, and then it switches to a pattern where do 3 knits and a purl, 3 knits and a purl. So you're eliminating one of the purl columns and converting it into a knit, and then after a while you do that again, and so the stockinette sections are getting wider and wider. And it's really a cool looking if you're using a really smooth yarn, but this chainette yarn is a little textured, so you can see the pattern once it's knit up. But as I'm knitting it, I wasn't convinced that it was going to look very good, but I think it's going to look okay. One of the challenges of knitting from vintage patterns is that often they don't give you a gauge. They will tell you a very specific yarn to use, and so you have to try to figure out, well, what yarn weight is that, and so you can find an equivalent in modern yarns. They might give you a needle size, but needle sizes were not consistent back then. Different companies had needles of different sizes. So just because something says that it's a size 4 needle doesn't mean that another pattern from that same era that calls for a size 4 needle, that they're actually calling for the same thing. Now, some patterns do list a gauge. The pattern I was working from didn't. It did list some needle sizes. Again, the needle size it listed was a size 4. And I did go online and looked for some sort of information about vintage needle sizes and what their equivalents are today. So if you look at the old UK sizes and compare them to US sizes, they meet at the US and UK 7 are the same size. But then as the needles get bigger, the US numbers get bigger. But with the UK needle sizes, the larger the needle, the smaller the needle size number. And so these vintage charts that I was finding seemed to be equating only UK sizes with US sizes, and they weren't really indicating what the equivalents were to the various needle size brands. But I know that there was confusion even back then. When I was looking at those old newspapers, looking at knitting patterns, I noticed that during World War I, there were articles in the paper that mentioned that the pattern that the government had issued indicated using needle sizes that were different from what people in, say, South Dakota were using to knit the patterns. And so they were telling people, don't pay attention to the needle size, and what you want to do is use this kind of yarn, and you want to get this kind of gauge. And so they were aware even then that needle sizes really varied and that you had to be careful of that, but there's no information that I can find now that helps guide me to what needle size to use. So I had to try to figure out the gauge. And what I figured out was, well, it was worsted weight yarn, and based on the bust size of the pattern, it was likely that they were looking at 7 stitches or 5 stitches an inch, and with that typically comes about 7 rows per inch. So I was able to figure out what needle size I needed to get appropriate worsted weight gauge in order to knit the body of the sweater. What I didn't have was a way to figure out what needle size I truly needed to use in order to work the ribbing for this pattern, because typically today we're instructed to use a needle 1 or 2 sizes smaller than what we use for the body of the sweater in order to knit the ribbing, but this was much smaller. They were telling me to use steel needles, and they gave some needle size, and again the vintage needle chart that I was using indicated that would be a 00 or 1.75 millimeter needle, which is significantly smaller than the size 6 needle, which is 4 millimeters, that I was using for the body of the sweater. But I went ahead and used that needle size in order to knit the neck of the sweater, and it was telling me knit it for 57 rows, not telling me how long that was supposed to be. Now I was knitting along, I've knit 45 rows, and it seems plenty tall to me, which could indicate that I'm knitting it that my stitches are too large, but I don't think they are, because I'm looking at how tight this is, and this thing has to fit around my neck. And I'm really not sure what I'm going to do about this neck. I'm going to start putting the sweater together this weekend, and then we'll see what happens. So I'm going to show you what I'm talking about with the neck in just 1 second. So up here I have the neck. I still have it on the needles, but it's quite tall right now. And I can't imagine having it be even taller. So I've got one sleeve pinned on here. I don't have the other sleeve pinned on, but it is finished. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the front closure, because this front of the sweater is the reason I knit this sweater, because I couldn't understand what it was about. I talked last week about maybe using snap closures, maybe getting some snap tape in order to close this front. And a lot of you had some suggestions, other suggestions about how potentially I could finish the front of this. One person suggested that I pick up stitches along the edge and then create a button overlap there. Someone else suggested using an invisible zipper. There are a number of suggestions that seem like they make a lot of sense. And they do if you think about it in terms of the way cardigans normally close. So cardigans normally either close, you have two pieces of fabric. They can either abut at the edges, and so you could have some kind of hook attaching them or a zipper like that, or they overlap like this. And in that case, you could do something like snaps, or you could do magnets, or you could do buttons, something like this. The front of this sweater is not going to work that way. The way this fabric, the accordion fabric works, the edge, you see how the edge is facing that way and this edge is facing this way. These two edges are going to kiss each other right here. They're not going to overlap like this, and they're not going to be flat like this. In both cases, that's going to disrupt this sort of zigzaggy nature of the fabric. So the way this fabric is meant to be closed is with these two pieces of fabric facing each other like that. So my idea was to use snaps and potentially use snap tape just to make it easier, because I'm not looking at wearing this sweater other than trying it on. So I'm not interested in doing anything elaborate with the finishing. So I did find a site online that sells snap tape in different colors. So I got one, it's in Celadon green. It's lighter in green color than this actual fabric. So what I'm going to do is sew this in here, and then these two pieces will come together like that. And hopefully I can do it well enough so that the edges of the snap tape are fairly well hidden. They're not completely visible. So my hope is that I can get this thing seamed together tomorrow, get my husband's hat finished tonight, and then seam this sweater tomorrow. We have a Knitters Guild meeting on Sunday. We have our annual tea for members, and so I'm hoping that I can wear it to there and show it off. I'm hoping, so we'll see. So I want to talk to you about this UFO that I showed you last week. Because the decision I made about this UFO last week was that I was done working on it. I mentioned briefly what the original intent was of this particular item, and I made a decision that I just wasn't going to continue working on it anymore. I got an unusual number of comments about that particular item, with all kinds of suggestions about what I could do with it. At least one person was very concerned about don't frog it. At least one person suggested I finish it as a cowl, as I had sort of was the secondary intent for this particular UFO. Was not the primary reason that I knit it. It was a sort of a secondary goal behind it. And a lot of you wanted me to turn it into a pillow. I thought I would talk a little bit about what my thought process is when I make a determination about, no, I'm not going to continue with this any longer. Because I have talked a little bit about this in the past in different videos about what kind of knitter I am, what I get out of knitting, and then how I make decisions about going forward. Last year's Finish It February, there was a sweater that I finally decided I was done with. I had knit all of the pieces, say 25 years ago, and I knew it had been sitting in my UFO pile all those years. And I didn't really want the sweater, the finished sweater, for a couple of reasons. One was I didn't think the color would look good on me. Secondly, I wasn't even sure it would fit me anymore. But I did think, well, it was worth sewing up and finishing it, because then maybe I could donate it to someone, or maybe I could find someone that would fit. And what I finally decided was that I wasn't going to do anything with it. I was done with it. And again, after I made that decision, somebody, at least one person, suggested that I could turn that sweater into a pillow. And so I was thinking about this as I was walking my dog last weekend, because I'd gotten so many comments over the weekend. I was thinking, why do people want me to turn this into something? And so I think there's a couple of reasons behind there. One is, I think I wasn't maybe clear about my decision making when it comes to projects. But also, I think people just have different worldviews when it comes to their knitting. They have different goals for why they knit and what they get out of knitting and what they want their knitting to become. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about what my goals are. And then specifically, I want to talk about this particular project and what it meant to me initially, and then why I came to the decision I came to, and how that's related to economic theory and behavioral psychology. Because I think my decision about it is related to those things, but I think that some of your reactions to my decision is also related to economic theory and behavioral psychology. It's just how those things affect us personally. So the original purpose of this was a swatch. This is essentially an oversized swatch. The reason this exists is because I wanted to do a series of technique videos on stranded color work. So whenever I do technique videos, particularly if I'm going to be doing a series of related videos, I think about what piece of knitting I'm going to use in order to demonstrate the techniques, and does it make sense to do one piece of knitting where I can demonstrate all of the techniques, or does it make sense to just do smaller swatches? So recently I did several videos on sock heels and heel turns and heel flaps, and I did little swatches that sort of simulated those items. But I also compared those little swatches to a finished item that used those techniques, so I could show what I was talking about in terms of why you might want to make modifications. So when I was going to do the stranded color work, I knew that I wanted to demonstrate yarn dominance and parallel floats, and I also wanted to demonstrate rotating floats, which creates a color work result that does not have any yarn dominance. So I wanted to show all of those techniques, and I also wanted to show all the different ways that you could handle the yarn in your hands if you did want yarn dominance with parallel floats, or if you did not want yarn dominance and you wanted to do rotating floats. So I needed to demonstrate things on the needles, but I also needed to show the front of the work and the back of the work at the same time. Now, typically when I'm knitting any kind of swatch for a technique video, I put some sort of border at the bottom that prevents the work from flipping, so that I don't have to keep holding it down or pulling it down while I'm filming. Particularly if I'm knitting, I don't want the end to be flipping up so that you can't see what's on the needles. So I thought about that, and I also thought about, well, what size of swatch, what size of stranded color work would I want to be working on in order to demonstrate this and to be the easiest for me to do. Because of that, that meant that I needed a border that wouldn't roll up at the bottom, so I had the corrugated ribbing at the bottom of the color work. And the circumference that I wanted to knit was 24 inches. I wanted to use 24-inch needles. I wanted to be able to just continue working in the round without being interrupted with needle changes at all. So I didn't want to work anything that was small in circumference. So I didn't want to work with double-pointed needles. I didn't want to work with two circs, because I hate working with two circs, but I also didn't want to work with magic loop. I wanted something where I could lay it down and you could see with the camera work that it was big enough and I could show it, and I just want to be able to keep knitting. So for me, that meant a 24-inch circumference item. Now, technically, I could have used like a 16 circular needle or something even smaller, but those do not have full length tips on the needles. And because of my knitting style, I want a full length 5-inch tip that I can hold in my hands. So when I'm making these decisions about how I'm going to make my technique videos, I keep all of that in mind. What's going to be comfortable and easy for me to demonstrate on camera while I'm holding my hands out like this? So as I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, well, I'm going to need I want to have 3 repeats of some pattern motifs so that I can demonstrate yarn dominance, showing the dark color dominant, yarn dominance with the light color dominant, and then I wanted to show rotating floats with no color dominance. So that's what I did here. So we've got the dark color is dominant, the light color is dominant, and here we have no dominance. So with those 3 motifs, I thought, well, after that I could do more corrugated ribbing and bind off. I could actually create a cowl, and maybe I could write a pattern and release that pattern. Ultimately, I ended up needing a little bit more length on this to continue demonstrating, and I chose to do a different motif than the one I'd been doing. I don't remember what the reason was for that, but what that means is that this is, first of all, this has this extra motif at the top, which does not match this. That if I wanted to just continue finishing this off as a cowl, I would have this mismatch business, and it would be too long. So in order to turn this into a cowl, I would have to rip this out, get it back on the needles, and then do the corrugated ribbing. I'm looking at that, and I'm thinking, okay, that's going to take some time to rip out and reknit. That's going to be, probably a couple of hours to finish that off. And then I would end up with a cowl. I don't really want a cowl. I wouldn't wear this as a cowl. The way this is right now on the needles actually continues to be useful to me for teaching purposes. In fact, I took this to my knitting group a month or so ago. There were a couple of women who were interested in stranded color work and didn't really understand about parallel floats and how to handle the yarn and needles. And so I brought this and showed it to them. I was able to show them the front of the work and the back of the work, and it was still on the needles, so I could have I could show them, demonstrate different ways of doing the knitting in person if I wanted to. So if I leave this the way it is, it continues to be useful in that way. If I rip out that top motif and then knit the corrugated ribbing, it continues to be useful as a teaching technique, but not as useful. That is, there's nothing on the needles that I could demonstrate in person at some point if that situation ever arises. If I finish it as a cowl, I can still show the front and the back and show the effects of parallel floats and rotating floats, and that is still useful as a teaching tool. If I turn this into a pillow, again, I have the issue with the mismatched motif. Then I also have to find some sort of a pillow form to put in it. I have to do work, and then it becomes less useful as a teaching tool because only the front can be seen. And then I have the added issue of I don't need or want a pillow. So I would be putting time into something that would give me an end result that I didn't want. So the way this all relates to economic theory is with the sunk cost fallacy. So when I make decisions about whether I'm going to go forward in a knitting project, I look at, do I still like this? What is this? Was this supposed to become? Do I still want that? So is it supposed to be some sort of product? And if it is, do I still want that product? And if I do I want to spend the time necessary going forward in order to get that end product? And so I do not look at how much time I've already spent on it, because that time has been spent whether I choose to do anything additional or not. I'm only looking at what additional effort and time is going to be necessary in order to get that end product. So if I really want that end product, if I really like what I have and I really want the end product, then it's worth it for me to continue going forward. But if I don't have a need for the end product, if I don't want it, it's not worth it to me to spend more time on it. So what I have so far, I like. I've met my initial goal, which was to use this as a teaching tool, and it continues to be useful in that way if I choose to use it that way in the future. So when I was coming up with what kind of swatch am I going to knit that's going to be comfortable for me and easy for me to demonstrate, I came up with this idea of, oh, well, I could turn it into a cowl and then turn it into a pattern. So turning it into a cowl on its own is of no use to me because I won't wear it. So, and it would take several hours to do that. Now I could turn it into a pattern, which will take a significant amount of additional time because the design work is done, the knitting is almost completed, but writing a pattern and making sure that it's correct and getting it test knitted and doing all of the work that's required for a pattern is not insignificant. It requires a certain amount of time, and most of that time is spent with me not knitting. It's not knitting time. So then I have to think about, well, what would I get out of that? What would be the end result if I put that time into it? And the end result would be that I could potentially make money off of selling the pattern. But I never know how much money I'm going to make off a pattern. And I don't tend to be motivated by money. I can be demotivated by lack of money, but money doesn't necessarily motivate me, particularly if it requires me to do something I don't particularly enjoy in order to get that money. So the way I was looking at it was like, well, I could put all of this extra time into developing and writing the pattern and getting it test knit in the hopes that I could make some money off of it. But that money could be almost nothing. It could be a lot. I never know how well a pattern is going to sell. So I looked into this sunk cost fallacy and this economic theory, and it's part of behavioral psychology too, that humans are more averse to losing than they are to the potential of gaining. That is, they are twice as upset about losing, say, $100 as they would be happy about finding $100. And so they've done various experiments, and people in your own life, you probably can come up with examples like this, where you spend, say, $10 or $15 on a movie ticket, and in the first 10 minutes in the movie, you realize this was a mistake. You do not want to see this movie. Some people will get up and leave, but most people will stay and watch the movie because they've spent the $10 on the ticket, rather than seeing that the money has been spent regardless. How do you want to spend the next 2 hours? Do you want to spend the next 2 hours watching this movie you don't want to watch? Or do you want to spend the next 2 hours doing something else that's more fun? So for me, that sunk cost is, I don't pay any attention to it. I am much more likely to just say, okay, what do I want to do going forward? Now, I'm not completely immune to the sunk cost fallacy. A few weeks ago, I was one skein into an Aran sweater when I realized I wasn't using the needle I intended to use, and I hadn't even done the gauge swatch on the needle I intended to use. So what I had so far, I could continue with and would end up with a sweater that fit me, but it wouldn't have the qualities that I had set out looking for in my Aran sweater. And I was really averse to frogging that and starting over. And that was that sunk cost fallacy business, where I didn't want to rip everything out and then have nothing to show for what I had done so far, until I realized that I could start over without ripping out. So I didn't have to lose what I had done. I could still have what I had done, and I could continue and start over and re-swatch and re-knit. And then once I got to a certain point where I was further along than what I had been when I realized my mistake, then I would probably be happy to frog that result. But it took me a while. I kind of got stopped in my tracks. I knew it was wrong to continue, but I kept looking at what I had put into the sweater so far, and I was really averse to ripping it out. So I'm not completely immune to the sunk cost fallacy. I was able to come up with a solution that let me avoid making an even worse mistake by continuing on. So when I was looking at this cowl, loss aversion was in my mind. I did not want to spend a number of hours doing something that I didn't particularly enjoy in order to maybe get some money out of it. So I was more averse to losing that future time than I was interested in what I could gain in terms of money. So what I hadn't done was to think about, well, what am I likely, how much money am I likely to make on this pattern if I were to produce it? So I went and looked at all of my previous patterns. I looked at the sales on all of them. I threw out the lowest one and the highest one because they really are quite different than everything in the middle. And I looked at what my average sales are and what the median sales are, and they were very close. And I thought, well, if I were to get that average amount, then it would probably be worth it. I wouldn't be getting rich off of it, but it would probably be worth spending that amount of time. And I hadn't really thought of it that way before. I looked at, well, I could spend all this time and then not get anything. And I think that's probably not very likely. I think it's likely that if I spend that time, I will get something back from it. I'm not going to get rich off of it, but it would be worth the time. So what that means is that I am planning at this point that I will rip out this top motif, I will finish this as a cowl, and I will write up the pattern. And at some point in the next few months, I'll probably be looking for test knitters for this particular pattern, and I will let you know more about that sometime in the future. So I thank you for your comments, your suggestions for turning this into a pillow, which I rejected, but it did require me to think really hard about why you might be suggesting that I do something with this versus why I was like, I'm done with it, and really make me think about it. I think it's likely that there are a lot of different reasons why people suggested that I turn this into a pillow. So regardless of what your reason was, I'd be interested to hear for any of you who suggested I turn this into a pillow, or one person said a skirt or something else, what your reason was for that. Was it because of how much work I had put into it already? Or was it because you looked at it in terms of a product and what sort of product could this be turned into? And so you were brainstorming in that way. I'd be really curious to find out what your thoughts were behind this particular UFO. And I'm interested to know in how you determine with a UFO whether or not you're going to continue working on it. Do you look at your sunk cost, or do you only look at how much time and effort it's going to take to complete it, and whether or not you're going to want the finished product? Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.